Ever since you were a child, you were told certain things aren't real. Ghosts, angels, demons, vampires, werewolves. The monster under your bed, the one in your closet. It's a comforting thing we've all been told all of our lives. But what do you do when you find out that the monster under the bed isn't so imaginary? What do you do when you find the devil is real? Sometimes people find these things out, and that's when they come to me. Join me, Kevin Mears, demonologist, for a look at the paranormal on my new YouTube video, Paranormal Encyclopedia. We're going to be talking about the things that go bump in the night and why sometimes there really are such things. Good evening, everyone. Thank you once again for watching. This is Kevin Mears' Paranormal Encyclopedia. Tonight I have my very first guest on, my good friend Dru. I could introduce him, but I'll let Dru do it himself. Dru, take it away.
All right. Well, as you said, I'm Dru. Dru Rusanski. I enjoy studying history, focusing on witchcraft and frequently things that go bump in the night, and crusades and whatnot.
Okay, so I'm thinking tonight we can branch out as we usually tend to do with these things, certainly, but I'm thinking we might as well stick with the witches and witch hunting, since it's kind of a relevant topic with Halloween coming up. You good with that?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so why don't you start us off by, if you don't mind, giving your personal definition as a historian of what the word witch means.
Well, throughout history, the term witch has changed depending on which language you're using. The English term witch usually winds up in a historic context referring to a very specific kind of witch during the early modern era, in which it was a practitioner who obtained their magical abilities by entering a pact in with a devil or demon, in which case they would sell their soul in return for power to vex their enemies, which were frequently the townspeople they're living with.
Okay. So because this is going to wind up coming up to the question sooner or later, I'm certain, where does the word witch sit in terms of Wicca?
Witch, as used in a Wiccan context, originally came from Gerald Gardner's wrongful belief that his religion did not in fact start in the 1950s, as has been repeatedly proven, and is now mostly widely accepted, but instead was passed down through a series of people and eventually given to him to spread, where he believed that there were pagans living in Europe that were persecuted during the witch trials, and in fact the witches then were of his religious line, which is complete and utter nonsense. There were pagans in Europe during the witch trials. No, they were not the witches. Most witches were ex-nuns. Not so much on the pagan.
Well, I agree with you, of course, but I do want to just state for the record, now everyone watching who's seen my previous videos knows that I'm a Christian. Do you want to state for the record the fact that you are not? Because otherwise people are going to assume a degree of bias here. Yeah.
That's probably the best indication, but yes, not biased at all. As far as, oh yes, they're all yay, Christianity. No, not so much. I'm pagan, just prefer history to remain historical and not rewritten for personal prospects.
I agree with you, and I want to say for the record, and I'm sure you agree with me on this, it's not that we're disrespecting people's religious beliefs, it's just there's history and then there's belief. They're not always the same thing.
Yeah, no, there's plenty of really valid Wiccan beliefs. The belief that the beliefs were originally derived from the witches that were persecuted is not one of them. Many of the beliefs were handed down through midwives, which had many elements of paganism, and in which case, had he written that was the origin of his ancient cult of magic, he pretty much be right. But instead, they now go by the term witches because that's who they trace to.
Yeah, so before we get into the trials, let's talk about actual paganism in Europe a little.
Which period? Which area?
The witch trial. The trial the Reformation in the main period of the witch trials.
So, generally, full paganism at this point in time was only practiced in the Baltic, as well as certain areas of Lapland and far enough in Scandinavia, north. But, for the most part, you had various forms of Christianity, which, as opposed to the belief of just Protestantism and Catholicism, it was far more segmented than that. Even if you look at the major branches of Protestantism, that's still not even beginning to scratch the surface as far as varieties of Christianity. Then, if you go far enough south and east, you'll also get mixed in. You have Muslims mixed in, and then Jews were spread across Europe. Sometimes invited in, sometimes kicked out, and frequently had to move around all the time. So, if you look at the pagans in the Baltic region, we know frighteningly little about them, as they did not have a written language, so the only records we have of them are of Christians. And unfortunately, the Christians didn't like giving credence to, as they call it, superstition. So they didn't document it in any degree of depth. We know a couple of their rituals. We know they had sacrifice, but even the names of their gods are sometimes debated and have many different spellings from different mostly monks and missionaries who had come in and written about them, but generally not in Germany. Their magical beliefs, though, and elements of paganism had very closely tied into elements of Christianity. Take, for example, the belief of sorcery, where you would bind spirits, devils, or the like for one's own personal gain through the uses of sigils and magical books, etc. However, was frequently practiced by clergy. Strangely enough.
Well, that's a whole other subject I want to get into tonight as well, if we get the time. Just because, this idea of, clergy doing necromancy. Things a lot of Christians don't necessarily understand. Obviously, my background's a little unconventional for Christians, but some of the things you've pointed out to me threw me a bit for a loop. Though, I get the impression at least Father Joe seems to be aware of all of it.
For the most part.
Yeah.
Given he frequently tends to point at the crazy monastic orders attached to the Catholic Church, then tends to forget that the Protestants had just as many problems with it.
Yeah.
But,
But still, it's just interesting of perceptions. But let's talk a little bit about the witch trials. The Europeans one specifically, since I know you're not a particular fan of the Salem.
I mean, the Salem one is interesting. It's just a lot more open and shut as far as it was political. It is pretty clearly political. And then you can try and nitpick details, but it's one case as opposed to several thousand cases. So, in Europe, it was a lot more logical than and reasonable than people give it credit for. Personally, I think it was mostly due to climate change.
So talk about that theory, because it's not one I've heard before, and I actually really like it.
Yeah, my theory on climate change and the witch trials is that during the period in which you have the Protestant Revolution, you have tons of people going out, and a lot of uncertainty was going on. You saw wide-scale wars, you saw peasant revolts, you saw nunneries and monasteries being closed down, and it was generally not a good time to be alive. Just, there are a lot of things going wrong. So, how does this all tie in? At the exact same time, just to make matters worse, massive crop failure due to climate change. So, how does that all relate? So, on one hand, you have kings and queens who claim divine right to rule. Divine right to rule, God has passed the right to rule down through them, and now they're able to pretty much rule over people because God wills it. If God no longer wills it, He'll make it known through signs and, take for example, crop failure. So, kings would go, well, that's not very good, but there was one conveniently written out. Witches stood to blight the crops of men and generally test the faith. So, they provided a very convenient out. A convenient out that was reminded, that Europe was reminded of by a man known as Heinrich Kramer, who wrote the Malleus Maleficarum, and then slapped on some other guy's name. Not that, but it's Kramer. So, this book's floating around. People thought it was so egregiously wrong that they started writing their own witch hunting guides because it was just so far off. Kings now have a bunch of witch hunting guides floating around and going, yes, find me witches. Please don't let the peasants get angry. They're already angry. We need something to placate them and put them back down in their place. So, find witches. If a king just were to give orders of find witches, yeah, he could have his knights ride out, grab some lady, drag her hair, kicking and screaming, and then execute her. However, that would be what most people view the witch trials to be. Yet they weren't. Frequently you'd have monastic orders going around, particularly the Dominicans, who would offer to actually search for the witch, and then provide them, and then interrogate them to try and figure out if they actually were or were not. Frequently,
So they waited the duck.
That was actually the trial. That's a trial by ordeal, frequently, which was actually the trial by ordeal was eventually used to try and make the trials more fair. Because originally, the way that they would conduct their trials was first through interrogation through torture, and sometimes without torture, but with almost always leading questions. They would have the witch claim numerous things to get the suffering to stop. The humiliation on the light end, or their most frequent form of torture, was they would tie someone's hands behind their back, tie rocks to their feet, lift them up by their hands, and then give a bunch of slack to the rope so they drop down. If they went just right, it would cause a large amount of pain. If they went too hard, they would dislocate the arms, in which case they'd have to take a little break. Otherwise, they'd risk actually ripping the arms off, in which case we might have had a witch, but here's a body. Not as effective.
Not usually, no.
So, that was the primary method in which they would find witches. They then hand the witches over to the secular authorities. In some cases, secular authority would take the witch and persecute her because they'd need some scapegoat for the failure of crops. Or they would immediately kick out the Dominican order and ask what the hell they did to that poor, poor woman. And then try and either bury her, so just get her out so no one hears about this, or pay her. The Catholic Church's formal stance on witches were either they're not real, or they're so exceedingly rare that they might as well not be real. For this reason, there were very few witch trials in Italy itself. Most of them existed in Protestant territories In Germany, England had its fair share, but mostly in Germany and France, where things were very politically charged.
So, I just had a good question, and now I was going to say, I seem to recall reading in at least one of the medieval texts, either the Malleus Maleficarum or the Compendium Maleficarum, but I could swear it actually explicitly recommended against trial by ordeal, because it saw trial by ordeal as a form of superstition.
I don't recall where that one is, but yeah, that is one. It was considered by some. However, certain orders realized that leading questions and torture was not actually a good method to get honest answers. It would just get someone to claim that they were whatever they wanted them to claim to get the suffering to stop. 400 years ago, they knew torture did not lead to good information. It
took us 400 years to forget that. That's the depressing part.
Yeah. So, they tried to avoid torture as means of getting a confession. Instead, would try and just test whether or not they're a witch. Because God would not let an honest believer die so easily. Or, that's one view. The other one is, if they're a witch, they would save themselves. Because witches are, above all else, selfish. That's why they sold their soul to try and get a slight personal gain. They're selfish and need immediate gratification. So, you throw them in a terrible situation. If they use magic to get out of it, there you go. If a devil sweeps in and tries to save them because that's one of their good agents on Earth, well, there you go. If the person starts actually dying, you pull them out of the water and resuscitate them. You didn't just... It wasn't a matter of, if they drowned and died, they apparently weren't a witch. Oopsies. It was a little more humane than that, albeit only slightly. As, like I said, most of the women who were actually persecuted were nuns. How's that one play in? Protestants closed down nunneries. You have a bunch of old women who cannot reintegrate into society, as well as young women, unless if they marry. Many nuns were actually forced into it by their family, but other ones actually did take their vows seriously and wanted to uphold their vow of chastity. Just because they don't have a building that they're allowed to stay in anymore doesn't mean they didn't take vows. So they avoid men, which is main area. They're the ones who actually own land, except for women who have had their husbands pass away. So they avoid men. They don't have money for new clothes, and avoid society. Very easy scapegoat. On top of that, think of all the 80s movies. The old guy that doesn't talk to anyone is always thought of as creepy. That's very...
Now I'm thinking of Monster Squad.
Yeah, I just watched that today.
Nice. One of my favorites.
It's creepy old German guy. Is a good example of how people fear those who don't follow social norms must make really easy targets. And likely targets, even.
Horror in general is full of
if you were
that
to...
sort of thing. And fairy tales. Good heavens, how many times is it the Wicked Witch, the old white woman? So, this is something I remember you telling me once upon a time that even I found a little surprising. And I have a little bit better idea than some people, at least, that the witch trials are a little more hyped than people think. But, estimation, how many witch trials were there in Europe?
I'm trying to think. I think the estimate by is about 100,000.
And Of those, how many, again, ballpark, do you think actually ended with convictions?
If memory serves, I think it's only around 60%. Frequently, you'd either have the person being convicted and released, or found not guilty. If a woman was able to withstand some torture long enough for a bishop to come by and go, "What are you doing? Stop that," it was generally a pretty safe out. There's a story of a girl in Italy who had been forced into a monastery nunnery, and decided she did not want to be there, and wound up creating an entire fictional world in her head, in which case she was a witch named Asmodea, and she had traveled the world with her devil master and done all these wonderful things. Basically used witchcraft as a form of escape. She wasn't actually a witch, but she's brought in because she claimed to be one. So, they brought her to trial. She was in prison for a while. And they never needed to torture her because she openly claimed it. The end result of that one, the priest who had detained her was immediately defrocked. She was then taken and sent to an asylum for mental rehabilitation. And her vows were considered invalid, and she was free to go after that.
Well, it's just fascinating, because I'm sure you've heard this at least as many times as I have, the popular myth that Buckland and Gardner circulated about the 9 million burn.
Yeah, that's just utter horseshit. It has been disproved.
I saw
so many times.
The math they used to come up with that, and it's like, really? Because basically they took the most executions recorded in 1 year, multiplied it by all of the years that there are recorded witch trials, and said 9 million.
Yeah, considering the witch trials would flare up and then die back down, then flare up and die back down again.
Yeah, it wasn't a continuous, non-stop, beginning-to-end situation, which is like...
Yeah, and considering that it went from not severe to severe, back to you hardly ever see it, oh, here's a case. That's about the worst way you could possibly do it.
Yeah.
Then again...
But it's hardly done by historians.
Yeah.
So here's a rather loaded question, but I'm curious. I know you seem to recall you doing some looking into this. Do you think there were actually any witches? In the sense that they were looking for?
I believe so. In the same way that there are currently people who do offer sacrifices to Satan. Is that the normal Satanist? No. Do they exist? No. Yes, they do. There was a belief and doctrine in witchcraft. There were plenty of sources. Certainly someone desperate probably tried it at some point in time. And there were definitely people who believed it, that they were witches, at the very least. So, as far as were the people who actually casting spells, I have no idea. That is not my place to judge as a historian.
True, and the question was purely a historical... Were there people who thought that? You don't have to be able to cast a spell to think you can.
And I honestly do think there was an actual witch heresy. Witches were considered heretics, which was not that bad by the Catholic Church. Most witches were actually given the opportunity to recant and rejoin the church. And that's where most of the ones who didn't get executed were from. Is recant, come back to the church, God will forgive you. Eventually, you'll burn in purgatory for quite a while. But eventually, if you recant, you can come back, and we're not going to throw you out of society further. You obviously have some grace to people, but there did seem to be enough people who believe there are witches for me to... And there's enough consistency across regions with enough variation across regions to match the same amount of variation you see with religion, the spread of religion. So conceivably there could have been some people who actually were organized would organize into groups and have their black masses. I mean, it was a depressing time. Who doesn't like orgies? Must have been pretty appealing in really dark times.
Well, I will say this: the Black Mass. I'm not sure if you're familiar with its history, but the Black Mass didn't originally start as a form of Satanism. It's started basically by Catholic priests as a form of love spell. I want to say France. Time period. Okay, I'll look this up unless you happen to know it, because I don't remember off the top of my head.
The only aspect of of black masses, as far as is connected to witches, in which it was the first one recorded with a witch trial with a black mass, was in Ireland. But
no, there is actual formal black masses that there are records of taking place, just not actually as homage to the devil. Like I said, it was done as a love spell. That happened in France under one of the King Louis. I'm forgetting which one off the top of my head.
Oh.
Look it up, and I'll bring it up in a future episode and send it along.
It does remind me, though, of another interesting thing. Witchcraft was periodically acceptable. You were allowed to perform witchcraft if you're using it only to break another witch's spell, or to save someone's life, as long as it's not taking their death and throwing it on someone else. If you're just purely healing them, or if you are breaking another witch's spell, you are allowed, according to the Malleus Maleficarum, to perform witchcraft. So,
well, I remember Malleus talking about a difference between natural magic and what the witches do as well.
Yeah, there were beliefs of natural magic. The Catholic Church went, no, the superstition, it's all wrong. However, there are plenty of Catholics who believed in natural magic. If you look at medieval magic, medieval sorcery, in necromancy, some of it was appealing to devils, some of it was appealing to the dead, some of it was appealing to other forces. With England, they frequently attached it to fairies and the fae. But the rest of Europe also frequently had their variation, and that you could also appeal to, and some Eastern ideas as well as old Hellenistic Greek ideas, and they all just kind of tied them together. And as long as you're not selling your soul, it's not witchcraft. If you do not have a devil master, it's not actually witchcraft, it's a form of nature magic or necromancy. Given, if you did any of those in France, it was still a death sentence. France had, within their formal, legalistic law, a prohibition against any magic. Except for divine miracles. They didn't say if a priest went around laying on hands and healing people that he was to be immediately set to the stake and burnt. That might have been a little extreme by French.
The Bible actually allows for those types of divine miracles. Like, okay, we're saying that God says you can't do the things the Bible says you can do.
Yeah, France was not that intense, even though they did have some of the most intense religious warfare.
Granted. So, you've brought it up, but let's touch briefly, and this is probably something we can look into in having you on again, which I'd like to do. But, what about the church's necromancers?
So, necromancy required, one, for a person to be very well learned, and two, for the person to be pretty holy. If you're going to invoke devils and demons, you have to be holy enough to resist them. That limits your choices on who can do it to a very small portion of the population, that being clergy. You
basically
did have some well-learned people who also like to practice, but generally laymen would not be as proud of their faith to go, yeah, that seems like a good idea. I'm holy enough. I pray 8 times a day. Most of them had other matters to attend to other than prayer. If they were going to pray that many times a day, they'd probably be clergy. But there were kings and lords and merchants who all decided to delve. Also, it required the books and spells to be passed down. It goes from one monk. Is a monk going to pass it to another monk, or is he going to pass it to a merchant? He's going to pass it to another monk.
Yeah.
So,
exactly.
Also, most of the spells were based off of Solomon, and that was their justification. Solomon performed magic. Why can't we?
It's an interesting logic, given Solomon was also granted wisdom by God.
Exactly. That was their idea. It was a matter of, if one had the right tools and enough faith, they could actually bend evil for good. However, using evil at all was very tempting. So, one had to be holy enough to be able to resist the temptation, not make any personal requests, as that would then lead them down the path to damnation. Given the general belief of the church was that if anyone were to do any of these things, this is also a little bit further back in time, when the church wasn't as adamantly against the idea of magic, was that, yes, if you do any of these things, you'll sometimes get a result, given it will never be good. You'll be tricked into thinking it was good. You'll be tricked into thinking that it's done for the greater good. However, that's just a devil beguiling you into slowly eroding your soul. And then, of course, was the even rarer school of using magic to try and summon angels to do good. That was worse than witchcraft, according to any religious person. Witchcraft is a form of heresy. You are twisting the words of the Bible. Meanwhile, summoning angels is a form of blasphemy. You are sick. God is the only one able to control angels. By you going, I'm going to call an angel and then command him, is to say that you are greater than God. That one's a little bit more severe. Generally. Blasphemers were usually not given the option to recant.
Which is definitely, if anyone watching this has watched my angel video, and if you hadn't, go watch it, I actually refer to exactly what you're saying here. It's like,
I apologize for
angels are God, they're not our errand boys. Which is ironic, because you can look at a lot of modern Christians and New Agers and things like that are going back and trying to summon up and tell angels what to do again. And it's like...
It's a pretty basic concept. Don't. But
people aren't as a species, we're not famous for doing what we should instead of not what sounds fun. I think it's probably a good time to start wrapping this up. Do you have any final thoughts you want to share?
I'd probably say final thought is that just because something's reasonable doesn't mean it's ever good. You might have to evaluate reason to figure out whether or not your premise is wrong. With the premise of witches existing and blighting Europe, the idea of hunting them is highly reasonable. The idea of using trials to try and make it more fair is highly reasonable. End result, torturing and killing women and men. Mostly women, but also some men. We do the same thing with terrorists. We have a false premise on what Islam is. We now hunt down and demonize people without ever trying to understand who they are or where they're coming from, and from a premise that we have a large looming threat over us. Those are necessary steps. If we actually evaluate that premise, it starts to fall apart.
I gotta agree with you entirely there. I mean, there's something like 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, and most of them aren't terrorists.
Nor do most of them actually disrespect women. Most of them are highly respectful of women. Actually, there have been more Muslim heads of state than the U.S. has as far as governors that were female. But
I think Islam is a whole video on it in and of itself, and just common misconceptions.
But, of course, we look at a couple of examples and use that as a broad thing, and... yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately you're right. And that's the thing, we haven't learned the lesson. McCarthy, same sort of... Yes, there were communists. Yes, there were communists invading the U.S. and infiltrating the way he thought it did. And even in fairness to him, there's some evidence it was more widespread than people think. But it still went too far.
Not to mention, did anything actually bad happen from the communists being in the United States? How much damage did we do to ourselves compared to how much damage did they do to us? It doesn't make sense to amputate to treat a paper cut.
I like that analogy. I'm just thinking, it's like, how much damage? Well, maybe a couple of spies here and there, but not nearly dramatic enough numbers to justify what was done.
Not so much.
It's the bazooka to swat a fly.
It really is. And while that sounds like a lot of fun, probably won't work out too well for whoever's passed the fly.
Yeah. Swatting the fly with a bazooka is fun until you do it to your favorite painting. Or anything else you don't want to completely obliterate.
And on that note, tangents.
But I'm going to wrap it up. Everyone, I want to thank you for watching. Again, if you like the video, please hit subscribe or like, put in comments. Drew, I want to thank you for coming on. I think you were a great guest. I definitely want to do this again soon.
All right.
Have a good night, everyone.